Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Christina Janzer, and my pronouns are she and her, and I lead the research and analytics group at Slack. And I'm so excited to be here. I first want to express a lot of gratitude for inviting me. So thank you to Colette and Alec. So when I told my kids I was going to New York, they were really sad and they didn't understand why they weren't invited to come. They work trips. I haven't done a lot of work trips in the last couple of years, so this is a very new thing for them. So I told them that I would put their picture up so that they could at least be part of the presentation. So my talk is about creating and growing a research department. And I believe this title was given to me. And when I saw it, I was like, oh, wow, I don't know if I know how to do this. And I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I saw this title. Even though I have built a couple teams before, but I don't know if I have the perfect formula. And I actually don't think that there is a perfect formula. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution. And context really matters. The size of your company, where your company is in its development and growth really impacts the decisions that you make as a research leader. So I decided instead of doing a how-to, I would talk through what I hope everyone thinks about when they embark upon the journey of creating a research team. You could also think of this as like, here's all the mistakes that I've made in the past that I hope you don't have to make, or things I wish I would have known 15 years ago. So I began my research career in 2007, and I really, quite honestly, I did not know what I was doing. And I was sort of learning as I went. And I've been reflecting a lot on how the job has changed over the years, and about how the challenges have changed, how the conversation has changed. And I remember so vividly earlier in my career, feeling like I was spending so much time strategizing, like, how do I get a seat at the table? Like, how do I prove my value? How do I convince people that research matters? Essentially, like, how do I convince people to do the job that I was hired to do? It's like a very weird thing to have to stress about. And it felt so much like I was waiting for permission to do my job. And I think that mindset actually encouraged a lot of the behaviors that I'm later reflecting on. A lot of waiting, a lot of doing what you're told, a lot of sort of walking on eggshells, and also like things like being territorial. And so I think a lot of the behaviors that I exhibited earlier on in my career kind of came from this mindset of fear. But I believe that this conversation has really changed over the last few years. And I don't think that we're asking for a seat at the table anymore. Like, we have that seat, and it's our opportunity and responsibility to take a seat at the table. We are in so much more control than I think we've ever been, and we can take more ownership in having the success and having the impact that we all want to have. My coworker Raz, who you all heard from earlier this week, sent this data to me, and I was like, that's exactly how I feel. 3% of researchers say buy-in is a major pain point, and that has gone down significantly over the years. And I definitely feel that way, at least in terms of my own experience. So when I think about a lot of the mistakes that I've made, I think they all came from this place of fear versus this place of empowerment. And I feel like I was trying to prove myself versus do the right thing, right? I was making the decisions that felt good in the short term versus the decisions that were good for the long term. And I think it brought out some of the wrong behaviors. So I'm going to share some of my, mistakes and learnings, and I definitely, invite you to reflect on yours as well. Okay, so let's start with, what is our job? So I would love if people just kind of shout out, what is your job? You're a researcher, awesome. Do people forget what their jobs are? Anyone else? Generalist, okay. So that's awesome. And you're obviously not wrong. I'm sure that that's what your resume says and that's what you're hired to do. But I think it's the wrong framing. And I think that our jobs are ultimately, well, I'll tell you what my job is. On my resume, it says that I lead research and analytics, but my job is ultimately to make Slack successful. And I think that having that framing is really important when you think about the role that you're playing. So research is important, but research is only one part of the job. Just doing amazing research is not going to have impact. I'm so sorry to say. In order for your research to have impact, you have to play so many other roles. You have to be a storyteller, you have to be an influencer, you have to be a follow-througher, you have to help your product folks act on the research that you're doing. And so having an eye on impact is so important, and just being a researcher is never going to be enough. And I like to think about this from the stakeholder point of view, and actually Beza talked about this a little bit. We can take more ownership in making their lives easier. Stakeholders, let me just think about PMs for a second. I do not envy the job of a PM. They have to handle so much. They're trying to launch products. They're trying to deal with feedback from their CEO, from their head of product. They're getting, complaints from customers. Their engineers can't move quickly enough. They're trying to work with their designers, right? They have so many things that they have to handle. And then you're the researcher that shows up and just dumps this huge report on their desk saying, hey, go act on all these findings. That puts a lot of ownership on them. And I encourage you all to think about, how can you make their jobs easier? How can you help them act on the findings? How can you sort of engage them in the conversation and spell it out for them a little bit more? And then also, being a little bit mindful of the fact that they might not be able to act on everything right away. There might be limitations in their roadmap or their technical whatever, and revisiting in 2 weeks or 4 weeks is the right thing to do. So really think about, what is the role of the researcher? One quick story. So we at Slack, we are all adopting like this remote first way of working. It's obviously something that we've been working on a lot over the last couple of years. And we wanted to really dig into how employees were feeling about that transition. And I was pulled into this task force as a researcher, right? We wanted to understand what was employee sentiment, what were employee challenges, how were people feeling about working remotely, what were the things that were going well and not going well. And so the research opportunity is obvious, right? So we ran some surveys to learn about how people were adopting to this remote first culture. And those surveys then impacted and influenced programs that we built internally. One example of this is Maker Week. We have Maker Weeks twice a quarter, and it's a no meeting week where people get to just focus and make and build whatever it is that they're doing. And people internally love it. But surprisingly, there have been some groups who have had a really, really hard time adopting these programs. And if I think about my job as a researcher who just does that survey, then my job is done. But my job isn't to make the survey. My job is to build programs that make employees happy. And so I've ended up taking on lots of different roles. I've been the person who stands up at all hands to talk about these programs and to help people understand why we're doing them. I've been going to sales all hands to provide training to help them figure out how to adopt these programs. And so thinking about your role as more than a researcher, I think is a really big opportunity for us. Okay, so Beza talked about this a little bit. There's a lot of similarities between our talks. You can tell that we've worked together. So I spent a lot of time earlier on in my career feeling very territorial, right? I think this came again from a place of fear. I'm still trying to prove myself. I'm trying to get a seat at the table. What's going to happen if somebody else claims that they do research too? Is that going to devalue my group? And so I think the mistake is thinking that I have some sort of right over research or that I own research. You're not a researcher. Why are you doing research? And I think the clear answer now to me is there's a huge opportunity to sort of reframe it as who owns research, to thinking about the idea that everyone ideally at your company feels some ownership in understanding your customers. And if you can get to that place, that is going to be a really, really great thing. And so your job ends up being more about supporting and scaling and enabling and creating an environment where you can give people feedback and you can support them in helping you in that journey of better understanding your customers. The example that I wanted to share is very similar to one that Beza talked about, which is the example of working with the CSM team. And I think my first instinct, to be perfectly honest, when that situation came up was why are they sending surveys? They should not be sending surveys. That is our job. We are the survey team. And I give Beza a lot of credit for being much more collaborative. And the result was so much better because the result is that they have these amazing, the sales team has amazing relationships with customers, relationships that we will never be able to have. And it makes so much sense for those surveys to come from them. And if they didn't send them, we would not be able to do the same, not just because our team was too small, but because getting access to these high-level admins or IT decision makers is very, very challenging. And so I encourage you all to think about the ways that you can sort of share the ownership of understanding customers, and that will enable a much richer understanding of whatever your business is. So this one is very similar, but I think it's a little bit different, which is the importance of befriending all insights teams. And I'm just going to say up front, this is very, very hard, and it can get really messy, but I think it's really important. And I think it can get very, very overwhelming to keep track of all the insights teams, especially at larger companies, right? There's UX research, there's market research, there's customer insights, there's product analytics, there's data science. There's so many different groups that are in the business of understanding product or customers or whatever it is. And I think it's easy to sort of have the instinct of, I'm going to create perfect swim lanes. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. And we're all going to kind of go do our thing. And I think that there's a huge missed opportunity there. And I think that there's a couple things to say. Is that you're missing out on so much rich data from all of the other groups who are learning about your customers or learning about your product area or whatever it is that you're doing. And I think that there's a huge ownership opportunity for us to figure out the messiness and to help get ahead of the potential inconsistencies. So what you end up seeing a lot is you see, let's just use an example of the data science team goes off and does this really amazing work. And what they're learning is actually like a little bit inconsistent with what you're learning over here. And it's easy to just be like, oh, I don't want to get into that. That's too hard to figure out. But there is a huge opportunity for us as leaders to understand what's going on and understand why that group is learning something slightly different than that group and figuring out how to reconcile and how to build a cohesive narrative. Because I can guarantee you, if you think it's confusing, think about how confusing it is for your stakeholders. When they're learning one thing from one group and another thing from another group and then another thing from that group over there, they're not going to know who to believe. They're not going to know what the truth is. And you are the best person in this situation to get ahead of that and to take ownership of figuring that all out and creating a cohesive narrative between all of the different data sources. So at Slack, we actually ended up combining research and data science, and we're all part of the same team. And I feel very strongly that that is the right thing for Slack. I don't want to pretend that that's going to be perfect everywhere, but I will say that it takes a lot of work, and it didn't come for free. It requires that you take the time to really understand the other disciplines, and that you are embracing sort of the messiness that I talked about. But I think that the result is very, very powerful. Okay, so leadership. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I could talk for hours about leadership. And again, when I go back to sort of this idea of living in fear, I think my instinct was sometimes like, I'm going to go off and do like flashy research, and I'm going to come back, and everyone's going to be so amazed, and I'm going to solve all the problems, and then we'll have a seat at the table. And I think that I've learned over the years that senior leaders never want to be surprised. And actually, I would say that nobody ever really wants to be surprised. And I think that there is a huge part of our role, which is scouting ahead and sort of getting ahead of the questions, figuring out what's going to be, around the corner 6 months from now. I think that it's a huge responsibility of ours to do that scouting ahead. But I think if you don't sort of leave breadcrumbs and figure out how to engage your senior leaders along that journey, you're going to leave them behind, and they're not going to be able to catch up. And so I think it's really important to be really transparent about what you're learning and figure out ways and mechanisms to keep your senior leaders engaged. Because what you don't want to happen is to go off for 3 months and do this amazing research and come back and your senior leaders are like, why did you waste your time on that? Like we're going in this completely other direction. And that happens all the time. And so and when I talk to researchers, I think there is this fear of like sharing too early when the findings aren't totally done. And that's exactly what you should be doing. You should be sending snippets along the way, helping them hear what you're learning, because they might be able to provide you with feedback that says, oh, that's really interesting. Actually, like this is what we're sort of planning from a leadership perspective. Like keep that in mind when you continue to go off and do your interviews or whatever it is. And so, thinking about how to engage your senior leaders. And again, this goes back to the point that your job is to help make the company successful. Your job is not to go do flashy research. And so keeping your leaders engaged in that will only make that easier. This is all about thinking about who you should be working with. And this came up a little bit earlier, but I think that, when you're thinking about getting a seat at the table and trying to convince people to do your jobs, I think this caused a lot of behaviors where you're just focused on working with the friendliest people. Working with friendly people is great, and you want to work with people who want to work with you. But you have to make sure that they are the right people, because sometimes they're not the right people to work with. And so, and sometimes it's just hard to assess, and sometimes you need help from senior leaders to figure this out. But you need to make sure that you are getting the right perspectives from the right people. And there's often a disconnect between senior leaders and the ICs on their team. And I think this happens for two reasons. One is that things are changing all the time, and it's hard for senior leaders to always, share that information down to the rest of the organization. Sometimes there's a delay. And two, ICPMs are always going to care most about the thing that they're working on, and that is always going to be the first priority to them. And so they're going to always tell you that what they're working on is the highest priority. This IC is also going to tell you that what they're working on is the highest priority, and only the senior leader is going to be able to tell you what that actually looks like and what's the most important thing. So what I've heard so many times is there will be examples of researchers or data scientists who have this amazing collaboration, and they've been working really well together. They're learning a lot. The PM is super, super happy. And, I'll go to the senior leader and I'll say, hey, I'm hearing about this really great collaboration. They're learning so much. And the senior leader will say to me, why are we working on that? That is not a priority. We should be working on this thing. And so it's important to, yes, work with people who are collaborative, and that's really important, but make sure that you understand that broader perspective. So this is probably a really obvious thing to say, but I think that there is, I think sometimes as researchers, we forget the superpower that we have. We have a real superpower. And I think that we can use that superpower so much more than we do. And I think we focus so much on the research study and the thing that we're trying to execute, and we forget all the other ways that we can use our research skills at work. And actually, honestly, in life, I do research all the time with my kids when I'm trying to figure out what's going on with them. Here, I'm just going to go straight to an example for this one. I will often have conversations with people on my team who will come to me and they're frustrated, and they say, I don't understand why my research or why my work is not having impact. The PM did not listen to me. They went in a completely different direction. Everything I did was super well aligned. I don't understand why this wasn't successful. And my first question back is always, well, what did the PM say when you asked them? What did they say when you pushed back and said, why wasn't this helpful? And the answer is always, oh, I didn't ask them. And to me, that is such a missed opportunity as a researcher to ask the hard questions and to follow up with your PMs and try to understand, why wasn't this research used? Was it something about the timing? Was it this? Was it that? Because I guarantee that if you spend the time sort of circling back on why your work did or did not have impact, you're going to learn so much that then you will take to your next study and your next study. And maybe it just had to do with the wrong timing. Maybe it had to do with the way that the findings were shared. I don't know. But you have so much ownership to ask those hard questions. You know how to ask the questions. And the more that you can sort of take that practice into your day-to-day will go a long way. I think about this a lot as a manager too. Being a manager is all about asking the right questions and being a good listener. And being a researcher has prepared me well for that. Zoom in, zoom out. We spend a lot of time, I think, embedded with our product folks and being, very focused on the product that we're working on or the feature or whatever it is. And I feel so strongly about, and Colette and I were talking about this earlier, about the need to take a step back and zoom out. Because if we don't do that, nobody else at the company is going to do that. That is our responsibility to take. And what we need to do here is understand how everything fits together, weave the narratives together, understand the holistic customer journey. Whatever it is, if we don't take a step back, nobody else is going to do that. And it's our responsibility to sort of advocate for the entire customer journey. And so I think, getting really deep with your products, it feels good. That's a huge part of our role. And it leads to amazing, amazing work. But I think building the right rituals, the right mechanisms to sort of take a step back, I think is a huge opportunity. And I'm not going to talk about should your team be embedded or centralized. Like, I think there's so many different ways to build a research organization. But regardless of the structure of your team, figuring out the right time to sort of zoom out is important. And a couple of things that sort of go along with this is, and I'll give you a couple examples of things that we've done at Slack, but one of them is back to what I was saying about the customer journey. There's so many different teams at Slack, the marketing team, the product team, the sales team that sort of interact with customers at different points in the process. And we were sort of struggling to understand how everything fit together. And so somebody on my team created this really, really amazing holistic customer journey that sort of helped us understand what it felt like to first engage with Slack for the first time. So this might be via a billboard or a friend who tells you about it, all the way through to becoming a super user and a really advanced user. And the thing that helps us do is it helps us understand how all of the different initiatives that we're working on fit together into that customer journey. And it helped us spot what were some of the gap areas where nobody is focusing, and what were some of the ways that customers were really struggling because the products that we were building did not fit well together. I think another example of this is sort of zooming out and thinking about what is the value that you're trying to create to begin with. And so we had a really interesting metrics review earlier this week, and we were looking at some of the messaging metrics, and we were seeing that the ways that they have changed over COVID. And when COVID first hit, like, usage of Slack skyrocketed. And we're starting to see some really interesting trends as people start to go back to the office. But looking at whether messaging is going up or down isn't really telling the whole story, right? If we see that people are messaging a lot more, is that good? Maybe. Or maybe if they're messaging less, it means that they have better work-life balance, or they're being more efficient, or something like that. And so what we've tried to do is sort of tie all those metrics to like a bigger metric around value. Are people actually getting value from Slack? And how are all of the other initiatives that we're doing sort of laddering up to that? And that's another example of like why it's so important to zoom out, so that you can sort of make sense of all of the embedded work that you're doing. Okay, so this is one of my favorites. Don't reinvent the wheel. It is so easy to think that you have to do everything. And let me tell you, you do not, and you should not have to do everything. And I think one of the unlocks for me was admitting that I am actually not good at a lot of things, and I would rather find the people who are good at those things to fill in those gaps. And so there's a couple things to point out here. One is don't forget to revisit old work. Old work that you have done can be new with just a little bit of a refresh. And I think that there's this thought that every single question requires new research. And I very, very much disagree with that. And you'll hear that a lot from PMs, where they'll come to you with a question and they'll say, hey, can you do some new research? And I encourage you to think for a second about what you've already learned in the past, because I'll bet you that some of that learning already exists, and you just have to bring it out of the archives, maybe repackage it a little bit, and just remind people of the things that we already know. The other one that I think is really important to think about, and this could have been named something like, it takes a village, which was another thing that I think about a lot. But there are so many amazing experts out there. And I'll give you an example. We have been doing a lot of work on sort of the future of work, and we've been doing a lot of research to understand some of the opportunities to make work better, some of the challenges that we've all been experiencing over the last couple of years. And we've learned some really interesting insights about sort of the differences that diverse populations are having in compared to, say, white people. And I'm not going to go into what the data tells us, but the data is super, super interesting. And I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert on diversity research. I am absolutely not. And I can tell you, though, that there are some amazing academics out there who have done such great work. And so instead of pretending that we have that expertise and trying to sort of, do the best that we can, we're engaging with Brian Lowry from Stanford. He's an amazing researcher. He's so excited to partner. And we're learning so much because there are so many amazing people like that out there who we can all sort of take the time to learn from. So this is my favorite. This is the mantra of my team. And it's kind of like a daily reminder for me that you don't have to do everything, and actually trying to do everything is probably going to set you up for failure. And I think this mantra is also about ruthless prioritization and really focusing on what are the things that you can actually make an impact on, and making sure that you focus on those things. Now, what I will tell you is this is not about every research project needs to be a 6-month endeavor that is the most rigorous and most thoughtful and most comprehensive thing that you've ever done. Sometimes extraordinary research is a quick and dirty study because that is the right method to answer the question at hand. And so I want to make sure that those things don't get confused. But I do think that it's important to be very, very specific about what we choose to tackle and make sure that you're setting up the work to be successful. Because like we talked about earlier, sometimes the work requires so much more than just the actual research. It requires the storytelling, it requires the negotiation, it requires the influence. And so making sure that you're sort of setting up each of your projects for success is really important. That's all that I have. I want to say thank you for having me. I think that our group is more important than it's ever been before. And I think that there's a huge role that we're all playing in creating more value in this world. And so I encourage you all to think about the ownership that you all have in that journey. So thank you so much.